Hi everybody, welcome back to Office Hours with the Brofessor, the show where I say things. Today we're going to talk about the fall of the increasingly depraved and corrupt Shang Dynasty. Now, last time we discussed how if you didn't happen to be a member of the Shang Dynasty's aristocracy, you stood a pretty good chance of getting ritually sacrificed to appease the spirits. The Shang were not a regime that was known for their human rights situation. If you need a refresher, please go back to the other videos. Remember, the Shang ruled China between the 16th and the 11th centuries BC. Okay, so the Shang were a very ancient Chinese dynasty that during their later period became more and more vicious and despotic. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how this bloody and cruel regime finally met its end. Okay, so the last Shang king, and his name, the last Shang king, was named Zhou. I think fourth tone. Zhou. Okay, and so we would say Zhou of Shang. Zhou of Shang would have been the king in the 11th century BC. Okay, so Zhou is the current king of the Shang dynasty, so we call him Zhou of Shang. Okay, and Zhou was not a good guy. Remember the last king of the last dynasty, the Xia dynasty. Remember the last Xia king, Jie of Xia, who was the guy who liked to get drunk and then have his officials give him horsey rides. Well, Zhou of Shang makes that guy look like Santa Claus. Zhou of Shang was, first of all, let's start with Zhou of Shang's beer pool, okay? So, not content with being just another run-of-the-mill alcoholic, Zhou went so far as to actually make a swimming pool and fill it up with beer, okay? And in the middle of this pool, let's write that down. I think the beer pool is pretty important. So Zhou of Shang had a beer pool. And that's literally, I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's this big swimming pool that was filled up with beer. And in the middle of the pool, okay, there was an island. And on this island were trees. And from the trees were hanging these skewers of roasted meat. All right, so we have a beer pool and meat trees. Okay, so when Zhou of Shang is getting his exercise in by doing his beer laps, okay, he could get the calories that he lost by doing beer laps by eating the meat that was hanging from the trees in the middle of the island, on the island in the middle of the beer pool. So that's the kind of ridiculousness that this guy got up to. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that sounds like a pretty good idea for a fraternity party.
Follow the 12!
And while it does sound like an epic rager that would be the talk of the dining hall on Monday morning, it wasn't exactly kingly behavior. So one day, one of Zhou's advisors confronted him on this matter, and he said, you know, Your Highness, this beer pool and meat island thing that's pretty ridiculous. That's pretty decadent even by Shang Dynasty standards. But Joe would have none of it. Joe said, "Oh, look at you. What a upright and honest man you are. Let's find out what an honest heart you have. What an upright heart you have. Let's find out what an upright heart looks like." And so he had the dude's heart straight up cut out, straight up Temple of Doom Aztec style, and like ripped his heart out and examined it. All right, so that was it, right? That's what he did to the guy who criticized him. So his vassal lords were not super amused at the fact that he did this, and they weren't just going to stand back and watch their friend get behearted, right? So in 1046 BC, they decided to fight back. 1046 BC. Okay? 1046 BC, the vassal lords of this despotic and evil king decided to fight back. At the decisive battle of Muya. The Battle of Muya. Now the rebels were led by the valiant King Wu of Zhou. Okay? So, Wu of Zhou. Now, Zhou, this is not to be confused with his enemy, King Zhou of Shang. Okay? So remember, it's not the same guy, not to be confused. King Wu of Zhou, the heroic, knightly, valiant King Wu of Zhou, has decided to stand up and fight against the evil tyrant, King Zhou of Shang. Okay? So, not to be confused, but we have Wu of Zhou versus Zhou of Shang. Now, the rebels only had 50,000 men. Okay? Now, how many did the royal forces have? The royal forces, King Zhou of Shang, had 700,000 men. All right, so we have 50,000 of the heroic, valiant rebels against 700,000 minions of this evil and corrupt emperor. Okay, well, maybe not emperor, but king. This evil and corrupt king. Now, the morale, however, of King Wu's forces was high, and their hearts were brave. They absolutely overthrew these 700,000 men of King Zhou. And even the 700,000, many of them, knowing the evil and darkness of their ruler's heart, decided to switch sides. It must have seemed unreal to the doomed Shang king as his mighty force crumbled before a relative handful, and even as his guys were switching over to the other side. I mean, it must have been like, oh, I just imagine some cool fight scene like out of Lord of the Rings or something, like from the army of the dead advancing on Minas Tirith, the forces besieging Minas Tirith. Although they were few in number, they knew exactly what they were doing, and so they were able to conquer this huge, enormous force opposing them. It was the same thing here. So we have this badass, awesome, super cool fight, and the conquering heroes have closed in on the evil king's palace, right? Now, Zhou of Shang was not one. He would not give his enemies the pleasure of killing him themselves. So he decided to burn his palace down with himself still in it. So that was the end of the evil King Zhou of Shang. And Zhou of Shang would later become so reviled by history that his name would actually be changed to a homophone, that is, Zhou. Zhou. And if you speak Chinese, of course, you know this is not a good thing to be named. This is the word for a crupper. And what is a crupper, you ask? A crupper is a part of a saddle. Okay, and the crupper is the part of the saddle that goes down like under the horse's butt, so the horse craps on it. And so it's the worst part of the saddle, and so he ended up going down in history as King Crupper of the Shang Dynasty because everyone hated him that much. So this was his name. His name was Horseshit, basically. He was not a popular guy. So this once mighty dynasty, the Shang, had fallen, and a new dynasty would rise. The Zhou dynasty, with this heroic King Wu of Zhou at its head. Now, we're going to learn more about this cool Zhou dynasty next time on Origins of Chinese Civilization, Part 10, The Mandate of Heaven. See you next time.